We'll bring the meeting to order at 7 p.m. with the Planning and Zoning Commission agenda. Has everybody read their September 9th minutes?
Would you like me to do a roll call first?
Oh, yes, I suppose we should.
Roll call, Sam Anderson.
Here.
Christine Ballard is absent. Glenda Bloomingdale.
Here?
Nancy Carr.
Here.
Brett Fergie.
Here.
Nathan Maz.
Here.
David May.
Here.
And Deputy Clerk Jess Pearson is joining us for this.
Has everybody read the minutes from September 9th? We'll entertain a motion if there's no corrections or no discussion.
I'll make a motion, we approve the minutes from September 9th.
I second.
Nancy makes a motion to approve the Planning and Zoning Commission public hearing minutes from September 9th. And Sam seconds. All those in favor?
Aye. Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Our new business for tonight is Mr. Dan Boland's going to teach us the rules and the guidelines for these meetings. Since most of us are new to this board.
Sure. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, members of the Planning and Zoning Commission. As you might know, I'm Dan Boland. We're with Ansel Link Law Firm, and when I'm not here at meetings like this, from time to time, we're out doing trainings like this for planning and zoning commissions all over the state with the American Planning Association. And so some of the things that we talk about during those trainings are kind of giving you an overview of the development process. There's going to be some things that are connected to the development that you might have heard of that aren't necessarily in your jurisdiction, but you might be interested in knowing more about to give you a fuller background of what the development process looks like. Then we often get into rules of procedure and helping you understand your role and your jurisdiction in that development process. And then the most important things of that are the rules of procedure and the standards by which you recommend different zoning approvals. And then we often talk about good governance, ethics, OMA and FOIA, but we really want this to be a training that's useful to you. We want to talk about the questions that you have, so I'm going to kind of go through things in that kind of general overview. As we said before we get started, I only expect this to take 4 or 5 hours. Just kidding. But we'll go as long as you'll have me, and we'll talk about what you're interested in hearing about. So please ask questions to let me know what you're interested in learning about. But first is the overview of the development process, and you see you've got an outline in front of you that kind of touches on some of those major issues. For starters, we've got the comprehensive plan. Now, who's familiar with the village's comprehensive plan? Have you seen it? It's available on the village's website, I think.
Not anymore.
Or not anymore. It's available at the village clerk's office. Feel free to check it out. It's the comprehensive planning document for the village. It's an advisory, non-binding document, but it is a policy document that states some of the aspirational goals for what you'd like to see in the village, the kind of current and future desired uses, and that's actually one of the primary responsibilities of the Planning and Zoning Commission. When the comprehensive plan was last done in 2007?
Yeah, I think Nancy might be the only one here familiar with it.
Sure.
Oh, and Glenda.
And Glenda, it's a good document to check out because it kind of animates the background of what you're doing here when you are considering requests for zoning approvals. The zoning ordinance implements the goals that are stated in the comprehensive plan. So when the new zoning ordinance was prepared, it referred and was based on the public input and community engagement and the stated goals of the folks in the village, what they'd like to see the village look like for the coming years. Typically, the comprehensive plans are, long-term planning documents. They're sometimes updated 10, 20, or even less frequently than that. But you can update parts of the plan or implement wholesale changes to the plan. Those could be initiated by the village board or the Planning and Zoning Commission, and that's approved by a public hearing and then ultimately approved by the village board. Annexation is the next development concept that you might have heard of. I imagine that there's nobody in this audience that was here when the village was incorporated. So the way that the village has grown since then was through annexation of territory.
Nancy would have been here.
No, you think so?
We
As
actually
a
were
as a
incorporated
resident,
into the 80s, 70s, 80s.
So, yeah,
Yeah.
it was
Okay.
just before me. I was
Yeah.
in the area, though.
No.
I ask that question. I usually get zero hands.
Yeah.
But that's excellent if you were. But so you've been if you were, you've been around to see that any growth that has happened since the village was originally incorporated was accomplished through annexation. That could be voluntary or involuntary, and that's a decision for the village board. There's no planning and zoning commission hearing for that, but sometimes there's annexation agreements that might require consideration of requests for zoning relief that might come in front of you. So when you've heard, so sometimes you'll hear about annexations when you're considering requests for zoning relief, but that's kind of going on in the background as part of the development process. That's how the village gets bigger and incorporates more land. So when that land comes into the village, it's got to get subdivided, typically, if it's going to be developed. And the Plat Act sets forth the technical requirements for how you subdivide land. It's typically a two-step process with a preliminary plat and then a final plat that is approved by the village board. It's another item that you might hear about, but doesn't come to this board for recommendation or for approval. But sometimes subdivisions will be done as part of a plan unit development process or require other zoning approvals, and so you might be hearing about a new subdivision or even one lot or a number of lots being divided into more lots, and you'll hear about requirements for the subdivision code requiring dedication of lands, new streets, and impact fees for schools and what have you. Sandy, I think you had a question.
Well, I actually had a statement. So those of us who've been on here for a little while, have seen a application come before this board 2 or 3 times that was not complete, and that had a subdivided request in it as well. So what you're saying is that was kind of accessory to the zoning change and everything else that they had requested.
Right. So that applicant or it needs additional approvals above and beyond what this board, this commission recommends. So that's a good point. That's another example of how the subdivision might be, part of what's going on, but not necessarily for this commission to decide. So it's important to focus on what you're actually being asked to recommend approval on. Zoning. So as we mentioned before, this is what implements the goals stated in the comprehensive plan. Zoning regulates height, bulk, use, and other regulations. The different kinds of approvals that you'll see, you're probably familiar with lots of them. Amendments to the text is a text amendment. Rezoning is a map amendment. You're amending the zoning map that used to be on the wall over there. But variations, adjustments to the regulations, the strict application of the regulations in the code, the special use permits. Special uses are expressly allowed uses in a district, but they require issuance of a special permit in compliance with additional standards and conditions. Planned unit developments are a common type of special use. That is a flexible development tool, often used in subdivisions. Instead of applying for a variance for each lot, in a subdivision, for example, if they want to take in the side yard or something a little bit, and make other adjustments, the idea of the planned unit development, it's a flexible zoning tool. So you'll have a PUD plat that shows all the adjustments that they're requesting, but usually that's in exchange for a public benefit, like increased common areas or walking path or something. To the developer is producing a better development, hopefully, in exchange for all these adjustments. They think that instead of going by the strict letter of the zoning ordinance, that they can use a creative development to create a better product, they would think. Planned unit developments are common, but like you'll hear folks say that, like, oh, this should be approved, they need so many variances. Well, actually, that's the idea of the planned unit development, is to allow for the developer thinks that they could produce something that's a better result than what the code actually provides. Appeals of staff decisions. Of course, we have staff here tonight. Staff always gets it right, and they never make any mistakes. But people have the right to appeal those decisions, say of the building inspector or the code official. And those interpretations can be appealed to this board. And also, in advance, applicants can request code interpretations and ask, say, for instance, a novel use comes into town or into the world, say recreational cannabis, for example. So somebody could, before this board acted last month, somebody could have come into town and say, oh, I would like an interpretation whether my dispensary is a permitted retail use. And the code official could either make that interpretation, or they could apply to you directly for an interpretation of what the code means. I don't think that that would be a permitted use, but in the cannabis example. But since the board has since acted, that's now been addressed expressly. And and site plan review, that's another type of, approval that's, provided in the code, in terms of for certain developments requiring review of the locations on the site plan. Any questions before we move to your role? This is the most important part, I would think. Not that I'm ranking them, but they're all equally important in my heart. But the Planning and Zoning Commission is provided by statute. Plan Commission can, in a village could be made up as many members as you want. You all have 7, the same as the number of Zoning Board of Appeals members required by statute. It's very common, and so does this village, have a combined Planning and Zoning Commission. So you perform the duties of the Planning Commission and the Zoning Board of Appeals. That's a lot of responsibility. You should be very proud of yourselves. The Planning and Zoning Commission has jurisdiction over all these approvals. The comprehensive plan we talked about, the variations, code amendments, map amendments, text amendments, special permits, plan development approvals. And so all of these require some kind of public hearing before they are ultimately approved by the village board. Now, we're going to get into the difference between a public meeting and a public hearing. They might cover this in your Open Meetings Act training, but the public meeting is what the village board has all the time, and so do you. But sometimes during your meetings you have public hearings, and why is that important? Well, promise not to fall asleep, but this is really interesting to me. It might be only interesting to me, but it has to do with Brett, don't fall asleep. The due process clause of the United States Constitution, before the government can deprive someone of property right, they require due process. And that's following fair procedures and making sure that the laws are reasonable. And so there's 2 kinds of due process. There's procedural due process, so the rules of procedure that we're going to talk about, and substantive due process, the standards that we're going to talk about. And this is incredibly important because if somebody ever challenges a zoning decision the village makes, the judge is going to ask, were the procedures that were followed, were they fair? And was the decision reasonable? Was it based on reasoned standards? So all this stuff, all the legalese that you might see in these in the zoning ordinance and in your staff reports sometimes is there to help support these decisions to make sure in the event that they're ever challenged that there was a fair process and that the decision was reasonable. And so if we take a look at the rules of procedure, I think you might have them in front of you. The minimum that due process requires for fair procedures is notice and an opportunity for a hearing. And the notice that's required, you're familiar with it. It's or maybe you're not familiar because it's done before you even get here. Is published notice in the newspaper, the posted notice 48 hours ahead of time, the agenda in the Open Meetings Act, and then those are the state requirements. The village-imposed requirements require written notice to owners within 250 feet, and they also require newspaper publication also. So, and of course, the Open Meetings Act applies. Village imposed too. So we're gonna go through the rules of procedure. They're, might be a little dense if you read through them, but they are designed to be flexible. You're not gonna need all those rules for, your ordinary zoning application, but someday, a more complex application might come through, and these rules have been used in communities around the state, with some complex developments and contested zoning hearings with objectors and attorneys and what have you, and because that's allowed. It's like a court case. It's not like public comment, where somebody gets to just come up and comment. They can make public comment during a public hearing, but the applicant and any objector need to make their case to you why or this request for zoning approval does or does not meet the standards that are in your zoning ordinance. So it can be almost like a trial, but most, like nearly requests for relief won't be that complex, but it's good to know that these rules are there should a more complex application comes down the line. So let's go through the rules in ordinary public hearing. Most of this, you've used these rules for a long time, so you might be familiar with them. New folks, this is how hearings typically go. You might have even seen it in the public hearings that you've been a part of. The introduction by the chair, the request for relief is introduced. The chair swears everybody in at once because it's efficient and you can. And she throws it over to the village attorney or village staff for a summary of the request for approvals, just the basic facts about the request before we throw it over to the applicant. The applicant, it's their request, so they get to go first. It's only fair. They can put on whatever testimony or witnesses or whatever evidence that they want to demonstrate to you that a request meets the standards in the code. Very often, I've seen it here. These requests are not very complex, or kind of informal presentations that we see from applicants. Don't be afraid to be demanding of your applicants to give you the evidence that you need to understand what the project is about, so for you to understand whether or not this request meets the standards. Don't be shy to ask for more information from the applicant. It's their burden to prove up that their request meets the standards. After the applicant's done, we go to the public. Folks from the public might be there just to make comments, or they might be objectors that are there to put on their evidence and witnesses and testimony to demonstrate that this request doesn't meet the standards. So you might notice that in the rules there's not a hard time limit on the public presentation in the rules. That's allowed for public comment rules, like at a village board meeting, as a for instance, but this is a due process hearing, like we were talking about. They need a reasonable opportunity to put on their case that this request doesn't meet the standards. Now, the chair can continue to enforce rules, rein in these presentations on both sides, by the way, for civility, decorum, relevancy. What starts to happen in a public hearing that's contested, you'll start to get folks stepping up one after another saying, I agree with that person. Like, that's super interesting. Do you have anything new or relevant that you'd like to contribute? The chair doesn't have to accept cumulative evidence, repetitive evidence. If that point's already been established in the record, we don't need to pile on. Decorum. One of my favorite public hearings I ever attended was a public hearing about one of those car washes, and the room was packed. People were upset that this car wash was near a residential area, and people were doing all those things I was talking about, standing up saying, I agree with that person. The chair kept them in line. Do you have anything new or relevant to say? And it kept things moving, encouraged people to, if they were there on behalf of a group, encourage them to get together and appoint one spokesperson. That's something you can encourage them to do. One person did step up with something new, was objecting to the noise of the dryers, and in the small enclosed room, much lower than this, pulled out a dustbuster and started waving it around, and just a noisy dustbuster. And while that was certainly new and maybe the most interesting presentation I've ever seen in a zoning hearing, it certainly wasn't relevant or scientific or useful to the standards that the commission had to consider, but the crowd sure loved it. But anyways,
Can I ask a question?
Go for it.
Nobody noticed the resident standing around with a dustbuster? Nobody noticed that a resident was standing around with a dustbuster?
It was a big crowd, and
Big purse.
and
Very public.
Yeah.
well, what we noticed is as soon as they got up to the mic, so that was for sure. Another thing that's useful for decorum, and this is one of my favorite civility tips, is make sure that the applicant and the members of the public direct their comments to the chair, and that's even a good tip for all of you. It's amazing how effective it is. It seems ridiculous, but it's very effective in keeping people from getting into back and forths, and it really diffuses the feeling that people have that they're being, personally attacked in a public meeting. When your comments are being directed at the chair, unless we're making personal attacks on the chair, but people manage to self-edit their comments. It seems like, and it allows the chair to keep the meeting orderly. If there's a question or if there's a statement that's made that needs following up on, the chair can take that comment or question and direct it to the right staff person, or direct it at the applicant, or direct it where it needs to go, and you stop getting back and forth and people shouting over each other. It's very effective, and it's a good part. You see them use it in if you ever watch the floor debates, the General Assembly. I do. Probably nobody else in this room does, but it's super effective. They insist that their comments are directed at the chair, and in general, they remain pretty civil. After the applicant's presentation's done, we mentioned due process. There's a well-established due process right during zoning hearings in Illinois to cross-examination. Now, what is cross-examination? It's not like what you see on TV. It's just the applicant has the right to ask questions of any other witnesses that testified, and the public or any objectors have the right to ask questions of the applicant's witnesses. This will almost never happen, and in public hearings that where I've seen it happen, it's never done well. But it's constitutionally required. You need to offer that opportunity, and it is in your rules to make sure that folks know that they have the right to request that cross-examination, and that's something that the chair can help moderate and direct. Same rules apply, relevancy, decorum, all of it. After we're done asking questions of the other side's witnesses, everybody's had that chance, the applicant gets the last word. They get a chance to respond to anything from the public's presentation or anything that the objectors put together. And then finally, it's your turn. You can ask questions of anyone, best directed through the chair to direct the questions to the right place. And then after all your questions are answered, it's time for you to deliberate. Decide whether you have enough information to make a recommendation, or whether if you're not ready, talk about what additional information you might need, things that you need to complete an application or what have you. I've seen this commission do that in the past. Or if you're ready to make a recommendation, recommendations typically in motions made in the positive. Why is that? So that when you vote yes, it means that you want to approve it, and when you vote no, it means you don't. You can make a motion to deny, but that's going to get confusing. It happens all the time, but usually your recommendation will come along with written findings of fact and a resolution, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Those findings of fact to address the standards that explain why your decision's reasonable. That approval can be motion to recommend approval with or without conditions. Very often, the discussion that I'll see you'll have when you're deliberating is what conditions do you want to impose on this approval? Something will come up during the public hearing, requiring landscaping from adjacent properties, common that I've seen. That when you hear from that, then especially now that you require written notice of neighbors might show up and have some thoughts or input on how to make this a better development or an improvement that reduces any impacts on them, and those can often be included as conditions on your approval. So, public hearings are required for nearly all the recommendations that are going to be made by this commission: special permits, special uses, text amendments, rezonings, variations, and appeals from the zoning administrator. Now, like tonight's meeting, for example, nobody's due process rights were at issue, so this isn't a public hearing. This is just a public meeting. That's sufficient. When the village board meets to approve a subdivision plat, that doesn't need a public hearing. That's just a public meeting. Annexation agreements, that requires a public hearing, but before the village board. But not to confuse things too much, but that's those different forms of zoning approvals need a public hearing for your recommendation to the village board. Make sure that their decision, final decision, is a good one. Do you have any questions about the rules of procedure? Anything feel free to. I don't know if you've had these rules of procedure before.
I think Glenda has, because she's had to run a few public hearings.
So-
but it pretty much was the standard, it is the standard that was followed when we had that public hearing for the solar.
Yeah.
The first time with the gentleman who came in looking for the solar on his house. It was the same procedures that were followed. They just now have their own copies.
Right, and so that's how. That was a pretty typical public hearing, and but you know, take a spin through those rules. If you got questions, let us know, because some things in those rules will come to life when you have a contested application, and it will happen someday. Not everything is going to go through here uncontested. Nearly everything does, but
I think the only one, since I've been doing planning and zoning in some capacity since 2011, has been the zoning code, the overhaul. That was contested.
Right, but that was more like public comments than it was.
It was. Formal objection.
A formal objection.
And that was the whole entire zoning code that we went through.
It was.
Right.
So
Pretty.
we pretty much expected there to be some public, being that we did the whole thing.
Right, that drew a little more interest.
Yeah, it took us, 2 years to get through it all, I think?
The village had been working on this since 2011 at least.
Yeah.
It was rough.
Fits and starts, we got it.
Yeah.
So,
And then the only other thing I want to say is sometimes when you won't see a formal application, if it's a staff-initiated text amendment, there may not be the handwritten application like you guys received with the solar one. So like with the cannabis, you guys didn't see a handwritten application because I initiated it.
right, we kind of knew what we wanted and didn't need an application to solicit information from the applicant, what the request was.
Well, plus we had some direction from the board as to what they wanted to, and,
Sure.
and then we started the process.
Yeah.
Great. Any final questions on procedures before we move on to standards? So the procedures were, make sure that the decision was made in a fair way, fairness. The standards make sure that the decision is reasonable, because when you tell somebody no, and that gets challenged in court, the judge is going to ask us, well, why did you do that? Well, here are the reasons why the village made this decision, and the village board's counting on you to do the heavy lifting to conduct the due process hearings to solicit these facts to make sure that the decision is reasonable. The code has applicable standards for all the different various forms of zoning approvals. The goal is to those reason that your approvals recommendations come in a resolution is that it has written findings of fact and that's required by statute, also required by the Constitution, really, to demonstrate that the application in front of you, there's facts in the application that demonstrate that this requested approval meets the standards. And so we've got you might all have, I would hope, at least have access to the zoning code.
Oh, I think they all have their own books.
Oh, very good. I'm
I'm
sure you.
not sure what they're doing with them. Do you need one still? I'll get you.
Sure, and read it every night. It'll help you get to sleep. But the
One chapter at a time.
but if you do want to check out something that's relevant to your day-to-day administration, that the work that you do here, check out the sections with the standards. And we've kind of got them summarized into a handful of words here. We'll go through them real quick, and you let me know if you have any questions about like what that really means. Obviously the summary here isn't binding. The full explanation of what the standard is in the code is what applies. And you'll see that in our staff reports and in the findings of fact. We'll set out the full standard and then respond with facts that we expect the applicant or that the applicant include in their application, or we expect that they'll put on at the public hearing to demonstrate why or why not that standard is met. Now, do they need to meet every single standard 100% in order to get approval? Probably not, but you need to demonstrate that they at least substantially met most of the standards or enough in order to support the decision, your decision to recommend approval or not recommend approval. So variances, you're going to look for a hardship. The strict application of the zoning ordinance will impose a undue hardship on the applicant. That needs to be a unique physical condition of the property. Just the way there's weird terrain, or it's a substandard lot, or it's something that was put there, created, that was not created by the owner or the owner's predecessor in interest. It was created by our code somehow, or it was created by just the natural state of the land. And so and then you look for, if you don't grant this variance, will this applicant be denied a substantial right that adjacent owners happen to enjoy just because of the strange way that the code applies to this particular property. It's not a special privilege. The variance request can't be just supported by a desire to make more money off the property, or it's got to be really something to address the strict application of the law. And, of course, the comprehensive plan that animates a lot of the standards is the request in harmony with the code and the goals of the comprehensive plan. So when we look for we're drafting these findings of fact, for draft findings of fact for you to consider, we look at the comprehensive plan and look for ways that the request might or might not satisfy the goals in the comp plan. The variation won't alter the essential character of the area, detrimental to public welfare, won't cause undue increase in traffic congestion. won't, tax public utilities, and of course, there can be no other remedy, than a variance, to address the application of the strict application of these, regulations to this property. That's variations. Amendments. Amendments are legislative, so text amendments are typically within the discretion of the village board. They still look to you for evidence that the public good demands or requires the amendment to be made. There are more involved standards for map amendments. You could see that they're there. The things you look for whether a map amendment is appropriate. This is changing colors on the zoning map. You look at the existing uses. Is there a change in the trend of development in the area? Has the current classification diminished property values? Is that classification of diminishment in property values offset by a benefit in public health, safety, welfare that means that it should stay the way it is? Would the rezoning would affect the enjoyment of adjacent properties or the value of adjacent properties? And then when you're thinking about a rezoning, very often you'll have an applicant come in like, I want the property rezoned to do X. I want to open a vape shop, or something. But so you might be inclined to think about the application in terms of the proposed use that the applicant's shown up with. But it's a rezoning. You need to think about all the other uses that are permitted in that zoning classification, and is this property appropriate for that zoning classification? Because that vape shop could be gone tomorrow when they ban vapes, but the property will still be entitled to permit all those other uses in that zoning classification.
In instances like that, is it better to do special uses as opposed to zoning text amendments?
You can, I imagine you could, instead
Or
of
variance?
well, there's no use variances aren't allowed in most codes or in your code. Variances that's a good point, are for bulk regulations, typically like side yards and depth and height and bulk. The approach that you're talking about, one way to navigate that issue might be to, instead of doing a map amendment, but we can't control what the applicants come in for.
That's true.
But we could suggest to the applicant that, well, hey, why don't you instead keep your property in its current zoning classification and make that classification or make your proposed use a special use in this zoning district. Problem with that is, well, now that's a special use everywhere in that zoning district. So there's trade-offs of both. The adequate ingress and egress, traffic, utilities, how long the property's been vacant. Has this property been vacant for a long time because it's classified in the wrong zoning district? That's something to think about. Is there a community need for more of this zoning classification? And that's map amendments. Special permits, these are when you considering a special use application. I think these, I don't know what the most frequent requests for zoning approvals that you might have, but special uses might be one of them, because applicants might sometimes be building a garage or something, or to try to and need some relief from side yards or what have you. But less frequently are they tinkering with the language of the code or the zoning map. And more often, they're asking for special permission for a particular use in their zoning district. And so you look for harmony with the code and the comprehensive plan. Will there be adverse impact on surrounding properties, interference with surrounding development? Are there adequate public facilities, the police, fire, schools, utilities for this proposed special use? The traffic congestion, no destruction of natural or scenic features. And does it comply with any of the standards set forth, other standards, the special use set forth in your code? You're familiar with that solar example. First came through as a special a kind of special use. It was an accessory use, but because it was a utility, it needed special use approval, and that's why it came before you. And those were the standards that you evaluated that request under. Plan development. We looked at this, talked about this a little bit earlier. This is that creative form of development, kind of special use. So you need to satisfy all those special use standards we just talked about. But the property needs to be all owned by the same person. There's a minimum area requirement. There's requirements for covenants and restrictions to be enforceable by the village. Things like, I don't know, stormwater detention areas, and there might be covenants in a subdivision, for example, for a homeowners association to maintain the common areas and storm detention areas in a subdivision. Well, your code requires those covenants to also be enforceable by the village, because that's a common issue in many communities, that homeowners associations, HOAs, don't always do it. And so the village looks for that right to make sure that those common areas are taken care of if the HOA doesn't. Public space, open space, and contributions of streets and other amenities. That's the trade-off. You're allowing substantial departures from what the code strictly requires. So you're looking for that public benefit in the form of contributions of open space or other amenities for the benefit of the community. Landscaping, perimeter requirements are included in your code, and street regulations and utilities are also required. So that's an overview of the standards, and that's what's in those resolutions that come in your packet. They're only drafts, and so if there's and they're prepared in advance based on what we expect the applicant to put on and from what we know from the application. But if there's other important facts that you want the village board to know about, feel free to toss them in to the resolution as amended, the same way that you amend your request for your motion to approve with subject to conditions. Do it the same way, because it's critically important in case we have to go to court someday, to explain why we made this decision, the village made this decision. We need to demonstrate that there are written findings of fact supporting the request for approvals and showing that it meets the standards. Questions about standards before we move on?
You guys actually did make a change to the resolution on, when you guys did the cannabis. We actually had to go back and make a change and get that approved. You guys have done that before. And just as somebody who knows the communication that the village board sees, those resolutions are really important, because that's really what the village board sees when they see your opinion. Glenda goes and talks to them about it as well, but that's what they see in advance, what this PZC board has approved.
And not all communities do it that way. Some rest on their laurels and just rely on the minutes and hope that they talked about all the standards in the minutes. But we think this is a better way of doing it. It's a resolution. It's kind of the way it looks. It's almost like a worksheet where you've got the standards, and then make sure you hit them all, and it supports the decision you're making. And plus, you don't have to wait till the minutes are approved to move this thing onto the village board.
And when I present it before the regular board, I try to make sure that if any of you have a different opinion in that, or if you all agree, that it's all mentioned to them, so that they know exactly where all of us are coming from. It's not just me saying it, I try to represent all of us there. Once I present the resolution and tell them what has happened at the meeting.
No, it's nice that you do that. Certainly
Not everybody does.
Yeah, not everybody does that. That's an extra personal touch that I'm sure the board appreciates. So, your recommendations got to be supported by findings of fact. The village board takes those and they make the final decision. They don't have to accept your recommendations. Sometimes they can make their own judgments. They're legislative body, and sometimes we all don't agree, but very often they almost always accept your recommendation. But they also, much like you, before you're making a decision on a recommendation, if the village board feels they don't have enough information, they could send it back to you for further hearing. I don't think that's happened, not in my time with the village, but it's theoretically possible, and for a controversial or technical application, that might happen someday. So I'm sure you're happy to see everything move on when it leaves here, your recommendation leaves, but it always theoretically could come back to you someday.
Yeah, or the reverse has also occurred. We had an applicant who kept going to the village board, and the village board kept kicking it back to the PZC.
Mm-hmm.
And then when the PZC said, we don't like it, can you please fix your application, they'd go back to the village board, and again, the village board would keep kicking it back. So it's also happened in the reverse, too, where the person tries to go over the village board, or over the PZC.
Tries to bypass
And
us.
the village board is very respectful of the recommendations here, and so they kick it back to you guys, because you guys are the code experts.
They also appreciate it too. One of the examples is the resolution for the cannabis. We had recommended that the park be added as a place we didn't want anything built near, and one of the board members did bring that up. She felt fairly strongly that she agreed with that. So that was something they appreciated, that we did adopt that into that resolution.
Yeah, our board does rely heavily, or takes your opinions or recommendations into consideration very heavily.
Any questions about standards or your approvals? I'm sure you all understand that it's a recommending body, and I think Glenda makes that clear to every applicant that comes through. They don't always know, because they're not here every time. That this is not not the final decision. The recommendation goes to the village board, and they make the final decision on those zoning approval requests, most of them anyway. You do make final decisions on appeals from staff decisions, but that's
Has occurred.
yeah, it has. Anyways, we've covered overview of the development process. We talked about procedures. We talked about standards. Now we're going to talk about some of that good government stuff. Just touch on it a little bit. The State Officials and Employees Ethics Act. You've got the Gift Ban Act. You might have heard of it. We're mentioning it because, well, it sounds like it just applies to state officials and employees. It does, in fact, apply to you. The village has its own local ethics ordinance that mirrors the state requirements, and it applies to appointed officials, much like yourselves. And so, what does it prohibit? The Gift Ban Act prohibits officers from accepting or soliciting gifts from any prohibited source. What does that mean? Well, an officer is you. A gift is any gratuity, discount, entertainment. It means a gift. Prohibited source, this is really broad. So any person that is seeking official action from the village, any person that conducts activities regulated by the village, that's pretty broad. Any person that has interests that may be affected by the performance or non-performance of an officer's duties, that's pretty broad. And lobbyists. If something is gifts and prohibited source is pretty broad. There's the gift definition of gift. I should mention is narrowed that the gifts must be related to or attributable to government employment or your official position. Basically, somebody that's giving you a gift because you're a member of the BCC. I don't accept that that would happen very often, but it's not. But you know, I think that PCC members are susceptible to this. You are citizen planners, as they say, and you're members of the community, and you should be mindful that there's these restrictions out there, and some things might appear untoward, and you want to make sure everything remains on the up and up. Can't accept gifts in violation of local gift ban policies, but there are a number of exceptions. Opportunities, benefits, services that are available to the general public. If there's free donuts for everybody at the local shop, and you're a member of everybody, that's fine. Anything bought at market value, a lot of these exceptions don't sound like gifts at all. Political and fundraising contributions are actually exempt. Educational missions, like retreats with other government officials, travel expenses for municipal business, gifts from relatives. That's nobody's trying to influence you. You would hope for gifts from relatives. Gifts provided on the basis of a personal friendship. They're not trying to outlaw genuine gifts. Again, the definition of gifts is somebody gave you a gift because you're a public official. That this is on the basis of a personal friendship. That's not in the definition of a gift anyway.
Can you use that though? Like if you just don't want to give a gift, like, oh, I'm sorry, I can't. Gift ban act.
No, I mean, what you say to your family members or personal friends, based on your interpretation of the law.
It'd be different though, we would extend you for a long time.
Food or refreshments not exceeding $75 in a calendar day.
Yes, so he did make a valid point, so you could eat at 11 PM and then continue at 1 AM.
Yeah, that would be one way to get to 150, yes. So, if you're trying to game the Gift Ban Act, yes. A lot of parties at 11:59 p.m. but
Still served.
Intra-office, inter-office gifts. I like this one. Bequests, inheritances, or other transfers at death. It's hard to influence somebody after they died.
Well, they still vote.
Especially if you're in Chicago.
And any items from any one prohibited source during a calendar year have a cumulative total of $100. So there's that kind of a catch-all at the end there. And if somebody gives you a gift and you think it's from a prohibited source and you think it's not one of those exemptions, you can always return it and avoid violation of the act, or you can donate it to charity. But I don't, based on the, there's a broad definition of prohibited source, but there's a narrow definition of gift, and there's lots of exemptions. But just be mindful that that's something that people are going to be critical of based on the existence of the Gift Ban Act. There's also prohibited political activities. I worked in the General Assembly when this law came into effect, because people before the law came into effect, and sometimes still after, we're doing campaign work on state time, and so that's the general what's animating the prohibited political activities regulations. You can't do campaign work on village time, or more relevant for you, with village resources. If you have a village phone or village laptop, or if you're here on the village Wi-Fi, are you checking, sending, and receiving campaign emails? That's probably not a great idea to be doing, because the public resources are for the public and not supposed to be for political purposes. So,
Can I add to that?
go for it.
Also very relevant for you guys would be asking staff to do anything while staff is on their time, or while staff is on village time. They're coming into the office or asking them to do something politically related would be a no-no. Because even though you may not be on that time, the village staff still is.
Right. So, just be mindful of that. I'm sure, nobody's out there probably intentionally going to do this, but you might it might just not occur to you, and since you want to help staff out, you also want to be mindful of for yourselves too, in case you're involved in any political activities outside. Just make sure you're not doing it with village resources or on village time. The Statement of Economic Interest form. Has everyone filed one of these? If you haven't, you should. It is a form that you file with the county clerk. You are specifically required to do it. Persons appointed to a zoning board of appeals or municipal plan commission have to file this statement of economic interest. It's going to ask you to make certain disclosures about your financial activities. many of them, the things that they're asking about might not apply to you, and so you see a lot of statement of economic interest forms with NA, but that's okay. You still have to answer the questions and still have to file it.
I remember right, Mrs. Cook's office sends that out, and then Sandy,
I do.
very efficiently hounds you to make sure that you fill it out and send it in.
Yeah, when I received them though from the county,
Yeah.
they're for the previous year though, so some of you have not seen it yet because it's
Right.
from the previous year's economics.
Mhm.
I had that question, because I actually had to hunt down somebody who has left this commission to fill that out. So those of you who have not, will see one shortly.
It's due May 1st of each year. That's a good question. It's due at the time of your initial appointment or employment, unless you're appointed after May 1st. So it might not be due for some of you yet, but
No, there's a few that aren't due.
it's worth checking out, being mindful of. The fines are $100 per day.
Ooh.
So.
Oh,
eh,
I should add that to my letter.
Or you could be,
Might be something.
you could be become ineligible for office, if it's filed late. But the most important thing is just get it filed. So, so that's one of the big to-do items from this section of the presentation. But conflicts of interest, that also comes up. Not so much for you all, but you'll hear about conflicts of interest, and there's two kinds, statutory and common law. But both are focused on what's called a pecuniary interest. It's a fancy way of saying financial interest. The focus of the conflicts of interest laws are typically focused around money. We often get questions about, I went to high school with so and so, and they're the applicant, or I'm that's my neighbor, and that's less of a question of people ask, do I have a conflict of interest? Well, like, the answer is no. Could you be biased? Maybe. If you feel like you can't make you're so affected by those circumstances that you can't make a fair decision, that you might be too biased one way or the other, that might be a time that you might consider recusing yourself or refusing to participate in that hearing. So that's the difference between conflicts of interest and bias. Conflicts of interest, there's the Prohibited Officer, Public Officer Prohibited Activities Act. Can't have an interest in a contract of the village. A public official can't represent a person or be called upon to act or vote on a village contract. And you can't take money in exchange to influence your vote. And that's probably the most relevant one for you. But kind of already touched on that in the gift band situation. But no, bribes are not okay.
Even $74 bribes.
Even $74 bribes. Gift ban is one thing.
Gift ban act, one of the things is the gift has to have a value of more, or the food or whatever has to have a value of more than $75. So even a gift of $74 is still a bribe under the conflicts, or still a bribe under there.
There's exceptions for this. You can't have an interest in the, a contract with the municipality, but the municipality might have a contract with, I don't know, a utility or, something like that. There's exceptions for that, and or they might have a contract with a publicly traded company for something, just generally getting financial services or something. There's exceptions for small contracts, publicly traded companies, local banks, things like that. But the concern of that one for you is not to sell your vote. Conflict of interest statute, can't have a direct interest in the contract, sale of any village property. Can't have an interest in the purchase of any property that belongs to the village, that's sold for taxes or sold through a legal process of the municipality. I can think of examples of this, but they're probably relatively uncommon. It won't happen for you. But it does not prohibit a person serving on a municipal advisory panel or commission, sounds like you guys, from having an interest in a contract, work, or business of the municipality unless the officer's duties include evaluating, recommending, approving, voting to recommend or approve the contract, work, or business. The village, depending on what you all do for a living, I don't know if the village has any contracts with your employers or what have you, but that's just kind of something to be mindful of, that you shouldn't have interest in contracts with the municipality. There's an exception for you guys, that narrow exception that we just talked about. Official misconduct. You can't fail to perform your duties. You can't perform an act in the intent to obtain a personal advantage. So don't do that. Common law conflicts of interest. That's again that non-statutory conflict, but you could still receive a financial advantage from, for example, if your employer was an applicant or something like that, and you stood to gain financially from the approval of something that comes before you, that might be a good time to abstain from considering that request for relief or something like that. So that's conflicts, and we talked about the difference between conflicts and bias. The other to-do list item, which seems to be very common, that I do these presentations, and folks haven't done their Open Meetings Act training. If you haven't, if you have, congratulations. If you haven't, do it and file your certificate with Sandy. Just to call back from the difference between a public hearing and a meeting. A meeting is a gathering, majority of a quorum, of a public body for the purpose of discussing public business. Now, break that down. A gathering is in person, over the phone, by email, text, or other means. How many emails with between all of you, between commission members within a period of time does it take legally to constitute a meeting? What do you think? I don't know the answer, and I don't want you guys to be the test case to find out. So don't hit reply all when you receive emails about Plan Commission business. Use the reply button, and reply all is not your friend. Nobody likes to be on reply all emails anyway. Just hit direct. If you have a question about something that's in your packet,
There's one arrow, multiple arrows.
right, it's the
One arrow.
do the one arrow.
When I send out planning and zoning packets, you guys will actually notice that you can't see each other. I have been trained to blind copy all of the members
That's
so
excellent.
that
But that doesn't
they
work.
cannot, if you guys hit reply all, it would not be an OMA violation anyway, because I specifically make sure that I have you guys listed that way, just in case.
Right. But don't take it upon yourself to
To try that.
email everybody. Be like, oh, hey, when's the next meeting? Just ask Sandy. She'll tell you.
Go to the website and bring up the calendar. The meetings are all on the calendar
Right. So
on the website.
the idea is that you're supposed to conduct business in public and not over a secret email chain. Public body, that's you. So gathering of a public body, that's you. A majority of a quorum. The 7-member plan commission, quorum is 4. The majority of a quorum is 3. So it's a meeting when 3 of you are together. All the Open Meetings Act requirements are triggered when 3 of you are talking about public business. So 2 of you can talk to each other, and that's okay. But once it gets to 3, that's the magic number where we need to be mindful of the requirements of the Open Meetings Act. The public business, discussing public business. Social, political, or other conversations that are not under the Open Meetings Act. That's public business. I would expect that the Attorney General's public access counselor, who is responsible for enforcing the Open Meetings Act, will take a broad view of what public business is. So be mindful when you all can have social conversations. We can all talk about fantasy football together whenever we want, as many of us. But when when commission members are talking about public business, we'll be mindful that the number of you that are there. 2 of you is fine. So if all of those things, you got a gathering, public body, majority of a quorum for discussing public business, what's required? Sandy's got to post notice 48 hours advance at Village Hall and online. There's an annual scheduled meetings. It should be posted, and you won't have special meetings. Well, sometimes you will.
Planning and zoning during that code, during the recent, trying to get that code together, we had,
Yeah, we had a whole bunch.
Personally, I think they're all special, but you will have special meetings, and those need to be noticed up the same way as regular meetings 48 hours in advance. But they won't, because they're special, they won't be on the annual scheduled meeting for regular meetings. You got to have an agenda. You have to state the general subject matter of any ordinance or resolution to be acted on, including those resolutions, including your findings of fact. Must list any agenda item that will be acted on in any way, but you can discuss items not on the agenda. You cannot vote on them. You can discuss anything, subject to the chair's patience. But Sandy keeps the minutes, or Jess. You approve the minutes. You do it at the beginning of every meeting. The minutes are not a transcript. So if you want something to be included in the record, make sure it's in your findings of fact, or is made part of the record, or is made, attached to the resolution to be included in, the submittal to the village board. The minutes are just there to say who was there and what you talked about. They're not designed to be a transcript. So, be mindful of that, for when you're trying to contribute to, the public record. The minutes might not be the best way to do it.
I do have a board member who you guys, if you ever have something you want in the minutes, he specifically tells me, I'd like it noted in the minutes, and then sets forth the things that he just wants to make sure that it makes it in there. So if during the middle of something you guys ahead of time know that you want this particular subject matter noted, make sure that you can say that as well.
Sure, and you can amend the minutes, that Sandy prepares. They're presented in draft form to you at the beginning of every meeting.
You can make an amendment, or you can, do a correction, too.
Sure. There's, the amendment is, you gotta get your friends to agree with you up here in order to support any amendment. But the intent is not to be, you can ask for things to be included in the minutes, but the intent is not, or the minutes are not required to write down everything that was said. Sandy's hands would get very tired. But
Not a court.
she's not a court reporter.
Don't have those skills.
Right. Anybody from public can record a meeting. We're being recorded. So the meetings must be open and convenient. I think the most example you might have heard in the news, there's a treatment center in Itasca, a controversial application there I think Itasca's it, in the suburbs, and they had a public hearing about it. There's this hotel that wanted to make I think it was an opioid treatment center. They were requesting zoning approval for it, and they set up the public hearing, and 1/8 of the town's population showed up, and they couldn't fit in the room, and so they had to cancel the meeting. It's not open and convenient. And they convened the hearing at another place, and they still overcrowded. And then they moved it to the high school in a neighboring town. Still, finally convenient, large enough to accommodate the interest for that public hearing. The public comment, you need to allow public comment at every meeting. It's on every agenda that you have, because it's required. There's closed session topics. You will not go into closed session, I don't think, ever. You need to conduct your deliberations in open session. The training, online training is required, and you file your certificate. With Sandy, the Attorney General Public Access Counselor is responsible for enforcement. You could also take an action in circuit court. Electronic communications, just your text messages, social media, not just the emails that we talked about up top. Do two or more, or three or more of you talking about public business on a message board constitute a meeting? I don't want you guys to be the test case that finds out. So it's best to talk about public business here. And
You have to keep in mind, too, Davis Junction also has a policy for social media that we need to follow,
Mm-hmm.
okay? There is a policy already written that we've got to follow.
Sandy, that would be good to share, and,
Writing it down right now.
and the other thing that comes to mind, that the village board, I'm sure, has public comment rules.
We do, but
And-
we don't enforce them.
Well, I'm sure they, would apply
They
to
would probably be
the
enforced if
subsidiary
there was
bodies.
a big problem.
Yeah, if there was
You
a
know.
need, whether it
Yeah.
just says it, but they need.
Oh, you don't need them until you really need them.
I know.
That's why you guys all know that I share a lot of the posts off from the official Facebook page for Davis Junction. If you notice, I very rarely will answer a question. I'll share the original post, but I very rarely put a comment on there. And that's why.
Following up on that, if somebody does have a question, on a non-official village page, if you direct them over to the village page, I can answer them. I can't respond to comments on other people's pages, but the village's pages are monitored and archived. So if somebody posts something underneath a Village of Davis Junction Facebook post, I have the ability to respond to it. And it's also, all of those responses are being archived, and we're doing everything that we're supposed to be doing.
She has to keep track of all those.
I do, but just,
Mhm.
I think Dan's encouragement on this one is just don't a bunch of you jump on the same Facebook post and start talking village business.
Right.
Right. Some creative person might see that a message is posted, and whatever creepy social media service said y'all saw it, and we're talking about it. It's just be mindful that you shouldn't be engaging in conversation about public business outside this room.
And I can give you one example that happened to me. I posted one of the, I don't know whether it was a committee amendment meeting or a board meeting. I posted it, and I made a comment on there, please make sure you listen to this. One of the residents replied, why? I did not answer that question. If you can't figure out why you should listen to this, then, obviously there was something on there that I thought was important, but I did not answer that question. And that's why.
Yeah, I think it'll be helpful to share the social media policy. Gets it more in depth. I'll probably answer more of your individual questions. I'm sure you all use social media in different ways, or not at all. So that'll be helpful to answer those questions. Freedom of Information Act. The best item on the agenda and the outline, because it's the last one. Each public body has a FOIA officer. We've got a good one. It's Sandy. Or the all public records can be inspected upon request. Well, what's a public record? Well, a record that has to do with public business. So this applies to electronic records. There's one court decision that about the city of Champaign. They were texting each other and tweeting at each other during meetings, and one court found that those were public records because they were during a meeting. But since the actually the Laquan McDonald so-called cover-up investigation, the FOIA and PAC opinions that came out of that case in Chicago about police officers' texts on their private devices, and so there's been a real aggressive push to find the Public Access Council anyway, finding and some judges at the circuit court level anyway, finding that public records on private devices, it matters that it's a record that talks about public business. It's mattering less and less where it is, especially as the advent of cloud computing anyway. It's not like papers or your old hard drive. Like it doesn't matter where it is so much that it is a public record. That's the trend. Doesn't apply to private records. If you use a village email to talk about your Friday night dinner plans with a loved one, that is not a public record. It's not public business. When a FOIA request comes in, it's 5 days to respond. So if the FOIA officer asks you for your public records, you might have to turn them over. So that's something to think about. I don't know what email addresses you all use to talk about Planning and Zoning Commission business. If it's on your private email address, a FOIA request might come in someday and ruin your weekend as you dig through your personal email looking for responsive public records, and you'll have to turn them over. So that's why this is a personal preference thing, but some, or it might be a village policy thing. Somebody might tell me in like an instant, but some people prefer to use village-issued emails or a different email that is just for Planning and Zoning Commission business. That way, you know where all the public records are, and they're not commingled with your personal emails, which are most of mine are spam anyway, personally. So, which is why I don't use my personal email very often. Anyways, so just anticipate. You guys probably won't. You guys probably won't have too much to do with FOIA, but that's just something to manage your own records in anticipation of there might come a day where somebody files a FOIA request about an application and requesting all public records, and that includes your emails about that particular application, should you have any. So you might want to just manage your email or your other public records accordingly.
Or just don't respond on those emails I send you. Because if your response when I ask you is the emails you sent me, I've gotcha. But if you guys are communicating in the background in your private emails, that's where it gets a little stickier. I think right now, though, everybody is just accepting my emails, and we are not communicating via email except for board packets being sent out. Keeping it that way would be good at this point.
There are exemptions, like attorney-client privileged documents, or certain like personal information. Building plans might be something that might come up in y'all's FOIA responses. But when you claim that exemption, those the Sandy will do those in writing, and those decisions can be appealed to the public access counselor, and that's pretty much it. So that's FOIA, that's good government, it's an overview of the development process, that's procedures, that's standards, that's everything I know. So if you're looking for more, that's all I've got. But, and I'm happy to answer any other questions that you might have, and I might scrounge up one or two more thoughts.
What's the definition of 48 hours? Monday through Friday, or 7 days a week?
7 days a week. You guys will never receive a packet later than 7 p.m. on Saturday, because I have to have the agenda posted by then. If you do receive it, it'll be like 7:05 because I posted the agenda first.
so that's 48 hours for Open Meetings Act.
Yeah.
So that's not like business days or anything.
I try not to come in on Saturdays though, so most of the
Mm.
time it'll be Friday afternoons, and some people call right as I'm writing emails.
Well, I was patiently waiting if we were gonna have a meeting.
How many of us have finished the certificates for the state of Illinois?
The Open Meetings Act training?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Everybody but one.
Everybody,
Mhm.
okay, good, very good.
Good.
Very
Two. Everybody but two, but one of them is my fault because I needed to get them the information, and I will after this meeting.
Okay. Excellent.
Any final questions?
You've just joined us, Nancy, you,
And I have
You
it
got-
right here for you.
you got some leeway.
You do. You have like 90 days from your appointment. You're actually probably still within it.
Mhm.
So,
Anybody else have any questions for the young man?
great, guys. This is, you're a great audience. We're still around if you have any questions. Take a look at the standard for your code. Take a look at the rules of procedure, especially. Take a look at your social media policy, and let us know if you have any questions that come out of that. But yeah, we're always available to take any questions that you have. But you guys have done very well, I think, in the handful of public hearings you've had, especially with all the new folks. And so hopefully this will be helpful for as you move on going forward. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Dan. Mic drop.
Thank you. Does anyone have any new business? Anything you wish to discuss? Entertain a motion to...
Public?
Oh, the public? Ms. Public, would you like to state anything? Entertain a motion to adjourn.
I'll make a motion, we adjourn.
I'll second it.
Nancy makes a motion to adjourn. Nathan seconds. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously.
8:42.
8:42 PM. Thank you.